Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to today's Nonprofit Quarterly Webinar, Strategic Planning, What Now? It's a big question. So we have a big panel, and we're really glad that you're with us today. My name is Jean Bell. I curate leadership webinars for Nonprofit Quarterly, and I'm also a strategic planning consultant. So today I'm kind of a third and a half panelist, and it's been a pleasure to co-create these ideas in this session with the panelists who will introduce themselves in a moment. I want to start actually by just taking a breath and inviting you to as well, a breath of appreciation. There is not a job in our sector that has not been unbelievably challenging over the last year plus. Words that we use in strategic planning like adaptive hardly cut it, do they, for what you all have been leading through over the last year. And yet here you are, still in it, still trying to figure out what's next for your organization. So just want to take a breath around that and appreciate you all and appreciate the panelists and everybody who's trying to figure out what now, what next in our sector. Let me share with you some logistics about today. This is a 90-minute session. We have a lot to talk about. A recording, including the slides, will be sent to you in a few days to all the registrants. We use the Q&A box to communicate, and you can talk to each other in there and respond to the ideas that we're sharing. Feel free to just put comments in there. I may occasionally ask you to put yes or no to a question that's coming up in our discussion. So that's your place to communicate with us and one another. We always evaluate our sessions. A pop-up evaluation will come up as soon as the session ends. Please stay for 3 minutes. It's just 4 questions and answer that to inform our program. Many of you are already leading edge members. If you don't know what that means, I invite you to go to the upper right-hand corner of our website and learn more. But essentially, the leading edge membership means that you come to all of these webinars. You can access the archive of all of these webinars, as well as getting a digital subscription to the magazine, which you see there on the right, the spring issue, Radical Leadership, is gorgeous. And it's the first issue under our new editor-in-chief, Cindy Suarez. So we're very excited about the magazine and how it serves this whole nonprofit quarterly platform. So we invite you to look at that or relook at it if you haven't looked at it in a while. 2 of the webinars coming up in this leading edge membership program, an exciting one for movement fundraising, groups that are experiencing huge surges in fundraising, donors, membership. What are they learning? How are they managing? What systems are they putting in place? We also have a webinar coming up on communal philanthropy, the growth in things like mutual aid and giving circles and what that means for fundraising and nonprofits. So we invite you to take a look at the leading edge membership program if you haven't already. All right, let's turn to our panelists. And I know you've read their bios, that's why you registered for this session, but give them a chance to say hi and introduce themselves. Dominique?
Good afternoon. My name is Dominique Samari. I am a partner at P3 Development Group. We are a consulting firm based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and we support organizations in designing and facilitating processes that create equitable and inclusive strategies, programs, and initiatives. And I'm really excited to be here with you all this afternoon.
Nadine?
Hi, I am Nadine Smith. I'm the Executive Director of Equality Florida, which is the statewide LGBTQ education and advocacy organization in Florida. And I live in St. Petersburg, Florida, with my wife and our 10-year-old son.
So glad you're here. Thank you. Thanks for being part of this.
And hello, everybody. I'm Steve Zimmerman. I'm the principal at Spectrum Nonprofit Services. We're based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin as well, right down the street from Dominique, and also with offices in Chicago, and work around the country with organizations doing organizational strategy and business planning.
Wonderful. And as I mentioned, this session has been co-created by the 4 of us, and 3 of us are consultants, and Nadine, of course, is a very experienced executive director who has a really interesting strategic planning story to share. So there's a lot of experience in the room. And also we surveyed you in advance. Thank you to so many of you who provided your thoughtful answers. They're incorporated into this session. So there's a lot of wisdom in this big virtual room. There's 378 people in the room with us. So that's a lot of wisdom, and that's a lot of people who care about what next for our organizations and our movements. So let's get into the discussion. And I think we need to start with context. The context is obviously very complicated and very dynamic, but let's name a few things. And I'll start and then just hand it off to the group to see what you think. One thing I would say, you see the question here, where was strategic planning going as a practice, like the practice of strategic planning? Where was it headed before the transformational kind of staggering changes of the last 15, 16 months, and where does it have to go now? And it doesn't mean that some of the places it has to go now, it wasn't already going, but we have this sort of compound question and context, I think. One thing I'll say about where it was going is I think there was a very live tension around the distinction between sort of predictive and adaptive planning, right? There were people who had become quite skeptical of spending 6 or 9 months, even 12 months to plan for 3 years or 5 years, that there was something not necessarily matching the dynamism of their work about that cycle. For others, no, that was a critically important cycle, and it was important to always have an active strategic plan. And some of you are probably along that continuum somewhere. And I think that the Trump election followed by COVID really amplified that issue, right? When unpredictable things or seemingly unpredictable things happened that for many groups forced immediate and dramatic changes in how they do work. Some of those changes continue on to this day. So that's an example of kind of a tension around how do I even use this process? How useful is this process? How useful is it in this operating context? And then the second thing I would say is that the acceleration of movements for racial justice, I think the way they're showing up, one of the ways they're showing up in the strategic planning conversation is that groups who were born around with equity, who have been BIPOC-led in serving, who work directly on racial justice, those groups are experiencing the kind of strategic planning issues around growth, pressure, media attention, demand, et cetera. And a lot of other groups, the majority of groups are trying rapidly at some pace of evolution to catch up and interrogate their own missions around race and equity and figure out what that means for their values and plans. And so that, I think, we're going to talk about a lot today, but is an example of a kind of a trend and a force that is really causing us to question our practices and indeed perhaps change our methods. So I want to open it up. Steve and Dominique, you're both consultants. You're encountering the field and the needs. Steve, I think you wanted to go first or we decided you were going first on this one. What are you seeing? Are the expectations that clients have different than they were a couple of years ago?
I think the answer is yes. And I think they are, like most things in today's environment, confused because what I see is, there's a lot of organizations that are turning to planning because there's a desire for some normalcy. And, strategic planning, we can think about it as being normal within our organization, something we used to do before that we can do now. And yet at the same time, there's a desire for urgency. People, we want change now. And so it is, I don't think those are necessarily in conflict, but it brings about the importance of strategy more. And then this desire for increased engagement. And so, those three aspects, normalcy, urgency, and engagement, have to be kind of carefully navigated. And I think at different points in the process, we're seeing people emphasize them much more so than they were in prior to COVID.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Dominique, what will you build on?
I agree with everything Steve just said. I think What I'm seeing that has changed, when the pandemic first started, organizations were in a state of panic, and organizations are still to some extent in a state of panic. But from where I sat, that's where I saw the most innovation, right? And so organizations um, were serving populations. They knew they needed help immediately, and they were kind of cutting through their own internal red tape and processes to deliver that with greater efficiency, because there was like true urgency inside of the beginning of the pandemic, especially around social services. And so one of our clients, a fairly large foundation, for whom we had completed their strategic plan about 18 months prior to the pandemic starting, they had lifted up as a priority inside of that plan, addressing the inefficiencies in their grant making process. But when COVID started, that all went out the window and they got money out the door quick. And so one thing I've seen is organizations that are really trying to now look at, okay, we have these innovations in the midst of a crisis. How do we sustain that, right? Like, what do we need in place to sustain that? How do we plan for that? And then how do we use that as a lens to really look across our other work? And so what are the other mental models that we've been holding that have been keeping these things in place that we now know we can shift because we saw ourselves do it? And where else can we kind of expedite the work? I think the other thing I've been seeing, and you touched on this in your opening, is that we all now kind of collectively have a shared awareness that our environment can be disrupted at any moment. And so I see a lot of groups doing scenario planning and scenario thinking. And so looking at it as a process, like what are all of these various range of future possibilities, both the good and the bad, the expected and the surprising. And then how am I creating various scenarios that help me think through right now, while they're not happening, what could happen? And so, the idea behind that isn't to then build your strategies around that scenario or that group of scenarios, but instead to expand your thinking to consider all these factors that have not yet come into existence. And then, of course, what we'll be talking about a lot today, everybody's trying to figure out how to do racial equity. But the final thing, and when I was looking at this question, I'd not really given this much thought, but when you said it, it deeply resonated with me. And it is something that I've been seeing, I think, and I'm hoping we're able to sustain this part especially. I think organizations are more focused on their people now. Like they have a deeper appreciation for their people. They see how staff and their constituents struggled through COVID. They saw what it meant for them and their families and their lives. And they're really trying to integrate like staff well-being and staff conversations and staff, in a different way, which is something that we definitely didn't see before the pandemic, at least not to a great extent. So that kind of is what pops up for me in the changes I'm seeing right now.
That's really helpful. And Nadine, please pop in if you'd like to hear. One of the reasons I chose this photo, just to share that, is that I felt, it's a boarded up business, so it speaks to COVID. But the truth to power thing, I'm building on what you just said, Dominique. I feel it all, not only in society, I feel it inside organizations. I feel organizations trying to tell themselves a deeper truth. And I feel that having an impact on their approach to strategy and their approach to people, as you said. So for me, this image kind of summed up the self, the other, the org, the movement, feeling right now. But a lot of it starting internally. Are we telling ourselves the truth, about our mission, about our impact, about how we treat our staff, et cetera? Sorry, Nadine, chime in, please.
Sure. It was interesting just to hear that perspective, because I think of the cognitive dissonance that I think organizations are experiencing right now. Part of it is we are living in a time of high volatility and a destabilization of structures that seemed, immovable, unshakable, and that offers challenges and opportunities, right? So, I think we are dealing with the twin, pandemics of racism and COVID. We're also dealing with this generational shift, where we are increasingly a nation of older white people and younger Black and brown people, and a generation that has grown up in a different racial context. And so, the ascent of Trumpism has put these things into stark relief. And so organizations are responding to it, not simply because there's some, great education plan that's unfolding in front of them, but it's a necessity. If you are hiring the best and the brightest, you are hiring a more diverse staff than your organization has likely ever seen. And so these things are happening. And I think that the cognitive dissonance between, the structures of how we generally think about strategic planning, the world is moving so fast that you plan and then it's sort of like, will that even be an institution anymore? Will that even exist in that way anymore?
Right.
And is the generation of folks who are moving into this work, those things are not viewed in the same way. So I think this is a time of such volatility and such an inflection point for the country that it has to resonate within the strategic planning process. And I think when we talk about our process, I'll talk about how it impacted us.
Wonderful. Appreciate that. I want to show you some data at this moment, which one of the questions, so over 130 of you, there's now 430 of you here, but, so 25% of you responded, thank you, to the pre-webinar survey. And the data is really interesting. Obviously, this is a self-selected group, albeit a large one, of people who are interested in talking about strategic planning. So this is not a random slice of people in the world. But the degree of organizational change that you're experiencing right now, the question was, how dramatically has your organization's sense of its purpose and positioning changed in just the last 1 to 3 years? So purpose and positioning, you see about half, either a lot or radically, and another 45% somewhat. I mean, barely anyone said, our sense of purpose and positioning hasn't changed at all in the last 1 to 3 years. So this also confronts the sort of just clockwork approach to strategic planning where the last one sunsetted, so we do another one. It's like, yeah, but we're in a really different space. We experience ourselves to be encountering very different demands about how we do our work. And so that's a pressure on the strategic planning process to accommodate at a minimum. Wouldn't you say? I mean, if this is the degree of change, we can't just kind of show up with the old toolbox and say, okay, mission, vision, values, goal 1, goal 2, goal 3, that doesn't seem to be where people are, right? A second question that we asked is, have you recently or are you now undertaking planning or OD work specific to race, gender, and other forms of identity? 74% of you are in the midst of that right now. Another 5% of you had just recently completed it. So again, we're doing these things simultaneously in the mix of the volatility that you just talked about, Nadine. I think that's just important to understand. And that's why we're asking, what now? How can these processes be useful and how can they accommodate all of this complexity? What I want to do now is give Dominique and Steve a chance to share as practitioners some of the ways they've been conducting strategy processes recently and what they're kind of learning, why they're using those frameworks, just to give us some substance and some things to respond to and to hear from them in their experience why these particular tools work when they work. So Dominique, I'm going to start with you, and I know that you use, it says down the bottom right there, this results-based strategy development approach. Can you just talk us through this at a high level for a few minutes? What is this about? Why does it work?
Absolutely. So we started using results-based accountability probably about 6 or 7 years ago. And it was developed with the support of the Annie Casey Foundation by this guy named Mark Friedman. He now runs a company called Clear Impact that does this work. So I just want to be clear that we did not invent this framework.
Right.
But it's a method that we found really helpful to help organizations focus their strategy and get really clear on what moves the needle as opposed to what's producing a lot of activity, but not necessarily producing impact. So the question that this really was born out of the Annie Casey Foundation was they were funding all of this work, right? And when they looked at the work, they weren't seeing the impact. The programs were having the outcomes that they said they were going to have, but like real population level shifts, that wasn't happening. And so they started with this question around why isn't the needle moving. And so out of that question, this model was created, and it starts with a really clear result. So for example, an organization is trying to address the issue of infant mortality. And we say our result is to reduce infant mortality in this community by 20%. That's super clear. I know how many infant deaths in the past 5 years. I know what 20% looks like I have a really clear goal ahead of me. And then we look at, get really clear on the that next step down is getting really clear on the population level data. And this is where you really want to look at the racial and other disparities. And so now I'm looking across my city and I see that really the infant mortality rate is highest in these 5 zip code areas. And I think that's really important because oftentimes we have these kind of broad brushstroke strategies without getting really clear about where to aim them, right? So now I know that's the population that has the most need, and that's where we could have the greatest impact. So if I focus on these 5 zip codes, that's like 70% of my problem. And I know inside of those 5 zip codes, it's predominantly African-American women, and there's about 15,000 of them. So I'm really clear on who I'm targeting. As opposed to looking at a city of 300,000 people and saying, okay, now where am I working inside of that? And then we get clear about the factors. So that's the next step down, and clear about which factors are supporting or impeding the result. And then we analyze that. Once we identify the factors, we want to get clear on which ones do we have the most impact over and which ones have the most impact on our results. So using the infant mortality example, the organization looked at where the work was being done around infant mortality, and about 70 or so % of the dollars were going towards unsafe sleep. There were campaigns all over town that co-sleep. I don't know if this happened everywhere, but there were a lot of co-sleeping ads and like, don't sleep with your baby. But when we looked at the data, there were only about 15% of those child deaths that were happening from co-sleeping. And there was like really large swaths that were happening from prematurity. And so looking at the data kind of focuses, we have a lot of assumptions of what causes these things, but this process and one of the reasons why we use this process forces us to get really clear on those assumptions. So that's why we create the factors, and then we do research to kind of test our assumptions around what is the actual cause. And so in this case, you know, all the money was going through co-sleeping, looked at what the real cause was, and it was prematurity. And so that allowed, you know, like that's what we need to prioritize. And then started to look at what drives prematurity, et cetera. And that's where then you build the strategies on the factors that have the most impact on your result and that you have the most impact on. And then from there, it's all about developing your performance measures and getting really clear on like, how will we know it's working? How well do we need to do this? So if you know you have 1,000 mothers and you have a program that serves 7 mothers a year, like that's not going to do it, right? And so we need to get clear on like, what's the scale that we need to do this? And then what's the difference? And then we track that so that we can refine. I always say the strategy is like our best guess, like it's our best guess at what's going to work. And so in order for it to be a best guess that makes sense, we really need to track it both at the indicator level and the performance measure level so that we can refine as we go. And then this last piece I think is really important. Once we have the strategies built, then it looks across the strategies and says, what partners, what collaborators do we need to advance this work? So an example that I often use when I'm talking about RBA is a group that build a mental health strategy for farmers in northern Wisconsin. Farmers apparently have like one of the highest suicide rates of any population. And once the strategies were built, they identified these seed dealers were a critical part of the strategies because they had the trusted relationships with the farmers. And so they trained the seed dealers how to like give them information about mental health and direct them to and connect them to someone else. Now, of course, seed dealers were not at the table and building these strategies, right? But it's really looking at once the strategies are built, like who are the unusual suspects, who are the partners, collaborators that need to be there. And then the last thing I'll say about this is that all of this needs to feed up into staff work plans process so everyone can see themselves in the work, know what they own, know where they're accountable, where they support the work, and how they're going to report against that work. So it's clear that it's tied to like the things that they're doing every day. So that's it. That's it in a nutshell, which I hope is a short enough nutshell.
It's the 8-minute strategic planning course. That was extraordinary. Can I ask a couple of follow-on questions just for people who may want to understand more how this gets played out? So if you were doing this inside a strategic planning process, and you could use what you just said at a program planning level, probably, even if a whole organization wasn't going through it. But if you were doing an org-wide strategic planning process, would you essentially socialize this way of thinking, to the group, to the leaders, et cetera, because some people haven't been trained in this kind of thinking. So there's some education that happens. And then where the major work activities are or mission elements go through this process to develop one or more strategies about each body of work. Is that how you might do it? Or
so I think I can answer that first question, and that yes, we socialize it throughout the organization first. And I'll talk a little bit about an adaptive leadership training that we do kind of at the beginning of all of our strategic planning processes, just to ground people in like our way of thinking about the work and what are the like additional tools and capacities that they'll not only need to engage in the process, but also then engage in the implementation of this work. And then if you could repeat the second question, because I don't think I quite understood it.
Yeah, I packed way too much in there. My second question was, if you were using this results-based accountability framework in an organization-wide strategic planning process, would you go through these steps for each core program area or kind of body of work that the organization works on?
It all depends. So it all depends on whether folks are doing a complete revamp or not. And so the result can exist at any level. It can be the overarching result, and then we're identifying, and then your strategy speed up to that result. If you have a body of work and you're like, so if I use the work that we did with the foundation, they already had they weren't result statements, but they had their bodies of work outlined. And so then it became a matter of creating a result statement for each body of work and developing the strategies that would then support that work, as opposed to creating an umbrella result statement and creating completely new strategies that fed up to that statement. Does that make sense?
It really does. And it's a great reminder about the fact that unless you are just getting founded, you're not starting over, right? And part of what we're trying to figure out with these processes is how do we take these ideas and put them into what is working and what you do know and make it stronger.
The process looked, we adapt it depending on our clients' needs, and it almost never looks the same. The steps are the same, but it's never facilitated in the same way every time because everybody has different needs.
Right. But what I take away from it, among other things, is that starting with a result is a really different than even starting with, say, a mission. I mean, some people might see them the same way, but they're not necessarily the same. And that this orientation is much more to where do we want to move the dial? And I know you've been using human service examples, but I always say there may be a way you want to move the dial in the arts, in policy, right? I mean, we're all trying to move something, right? So that's what excites me about this particular methodology, is having that discussion at the beginning. What are we trying to move the dial on, and backing into the strategies is what I'm feeling when I hear you describe that.
Nope, that's exactly right. And I often say I hate mission and visions. It's not that I hate them. I don't hate them. I love mission and visions. I love them. If you name your favorite organization, that's not your organization, I dare you to restate the mission and vision. I dare you. I love all these various organizations, but I can't restate their mission or vision. So I think the specificity that missions don't tend to require specificity. They inspire. They are aspirational. They are a point to get to. I think for planning processes, the idea that you want to get as specific as possible, so you know what you're being held accountable to, and you can communicate that effectively and track it effectively, is really where you want to get inside of a planning process.
Right. I'm going to ask you one more question because I see a question in the Q&A that I think probably a number of people are thinking, and I know we're speaking in general terms, and you said, of course, you tailor this in every situation. When an organization can only address a small part of a problem, for instance, it has the humility to recognize that, is not solving the whole problem or not even trying to, or when they're trying to solve something that feels, where the answers aren't clear, all the factors aren't clear. Can we still get to this kind of rigor? I think people feel like, oh, well, we're too small to do this, or, we don't own enough of the pie to do this. Is there a way to adapt this to smaller organizations or where situations where there's less certainty about how things are going to unfold?
Yes. And so the example I can give, and I think it's because our minds tend to go out to like the largesse of these problems we're trying to solve, right? But what we always talk about, especially we do a lot of coalition building work, is that like those problems can't be solved by an organization. Like that's just not possible.
Right.
But the example I would give inside of that is I'm currently working with a church who's working on racial equity and inclusion issues. And, when they started the process, because the process feels, it requires a reorientation, as you said, and it feels a little difficult to process conceptually. It's not really until you get into it. And so, of course, they started with this huge result, like, they want to fix racism in Milwaukee. I'm like, oh, okay. But where we got them to is that their result is that they want to increase the number of business and faith-based leaders who feel empowered and educated around issues of racial equity and inclusion by X%. And so they wanted, they want to do, I think, 750 people. That still, of course, is contributing to this larger goal, but it's a piece that they can own inside that goal. So getting really clear of like, what is your work that's aimed at the issue, but at your part of the issue that you can address.
That's a really helpful example. Thank you so much. And I know we'll be referring to this as we move on in the conversation. Thank you for walking us through that. Steve, do you want to share a little bit about how you and your team at Spectrum are approaching strategy?
Sure. So, a lot of it is actually really similar to what Dominique said, using different words in some cases. I think strategy is inherently about where to focus to best accomplish our missions. And at its simplest, it's about really predicting the future and done correctly, making decisions or trade-offs to get to that mission or vision. And the problem or challenge is that we're not very good at predicting the future. We're horrible as individuals. As groups, we're somewhat better, but we're not great. So, as a result, a lot of organizations tend to focus on the word planning and do the planning part because that's what we can control as opposed to the strategy. We've talked a lot already in today's webinar about kind of the dynamic nature and a little bit of adaptive strategy. And so where we've really turned is focusing on the organizational model and, essentially helping people understand how does this organization function. And it starts up top there with impact. Now, we use intended impact. I'm in complete agreement with Dominique around mission and vision. So I'm an accountant by training. Wordsmithing, not my forte. And, there tend to be big and broad and inspirational, but we really focus around what specifically does this organization want to accomplish, and what will their role be in that, so that they can measure progress and be held accountable for results in that. So we spend, that is where we start with impact and really understanding that aspect. From there, kind of creating out a impact strategy or a theory of change as to what needs to happen in order for that to be successful, to be achieved. And then tying that into, okay, so then what's the financial model? All right, how do we generate resources? I'm still traumatized by working in nonprofits as the finance guy, that, we'd come out of a weekend retreat and we'd have great programmatic goals and absolutely no way of paying for that, or no way of putting into it, allocate how we're going to allocate resources to build that financial model. So we really look at that. What is the revenue strategy, and how does that align with the impact, and how do we make sure that there is strong alignment there? And then all of it, is about people. We're a people business, people that we serve, people that volunteer with us, people that donate to us, and as importantly, people that work with us. And so who do we need not only at the table during this process, but who do we need to have feedback loops with on an ongoing basis? And each of these, they're three distinct areas, but they're all so interconnected throughout. And our belief really is that if you understand this model and you understand how these pieces kind of work together, for one is you're creating an inclusive process, because then anybody can meaningfully engage in a strategic discussion about what the future of the organization is. I mean, we've all been in things where somebody has said something and everyone just kind of rolls their eyes because they know that will never happen. Well, it's because they don't have the information, perhaps, to really meaningfully contribute. And so this is a way of trying to pull back the curtain and let everybody see how the organization can move forward. Now, once you have the model, it enables an organization to really, adapt as it goes along, to address opportunities and challenges. We do identify, so on the next slide, Jean, we have kind of, we recognize organizations operate in this dynamic environment. And so given this moment in time, what are the strategic priorities to be able to, those arrows kind of going out, to be able to expand the organization's impact and influence in the greater community, in our world or market there, and recognizing that there's always kind of pressures on that system, but that hopefully, that model will hold. Now, it may change as you learn and as you adapt, but each of those components tend to be pretty solid, but the priorities by which you would expand them would change in response to that market moving forward.
So there's a lot of things I want to ask. So one is, what I'm hearing you say is that central to your work is almost like a collective deepening of the understanding of the engine of the organization, like the fundamentals of the organization, the fundamental reason it exists, the fundamental way it gets paid, the fundamental way it engages people. And that you're sort of articulating that in that inner circle that now has blue around it, as we all need to know this, or at least, a lot of people need to know this on board and staff. When you said that this allows people to engage, I wasn't sure, did you mean that some people will be more comfortable in one of those circles, one or two of those circles, and can contribute more, say on the revenue planning or on the people planning or on the impact work, kind of similar to what Dominique described?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that we each probably have a circle that we live in or that we're most comfortable with. But if you are involved with an organization, each circle overlaps the other. And so there needs to be an awareness of the other circles, and there needs to be at least comfort of finding out who is deep and knowledgeable about our people strategy, our impact, and making sure that they're part of the conversation as well.
Okay. And then you're differentiating between, if you were going into a strategic planning process, let me ask, you would introduce this concept and flesh it out if they were new to it, or as Dominique said, if they already, had a lot of the pieces of the model or had worked with you before or something, you would sort of revisit and refine that. And then you would do, okay, in this context, what are our priorities? That's kind of the goal setting piece, what been akin to the goal setting piece in a traditional process.
Yeah, so I worked at one point with a client that was an association of psychoanalysts. And I'll never forget, because at the end of it, the guy said to me, you essentially are doing what we do, which is you take the subconscious and you make it conscious. And that is in many ways what we're trying to do, is we're trying to actually, like when we talk about intended impact, I'm not trying to change their impact. I'm trying to articulate it. Now, does that mean that we don't, just like with a revenue strategy, we may need to refine and adjust. We need to get more specific. But, even for a startup organization, why did you start, right? What is the impact that you want to have? So I feel like people already know that. It is trying to move it further. Now, I will say, I think the people circle there is the one that is changing. That's the one where we're seeing the most change in organizations, as they recognize that they're not equitable, they're not inclusive, they're not really reflective of their community. And so that is an example where actually just documenting what they've done isn't going to cut it, and you need to change.
Right. One person's asking, you all have been debating the relative value of mission and values. Why do you have it on this model?
So, I have it on the model because I do believe that organizations still use the mission as a touch point. I think that the mission is important in communicating broadly and inspiring people broadly to become part of an organization. I happen to think that values are very important, so please don't take that out. I think they're very important, but I like to do them last because, look, I've been, again, part of too many processes where we will lead with them, and then that will be done. And then we'll actually do the work. And so what I do is I try to say, if we're going to do them, is I try to do them last and say, what are the values that are reflected in here? And if something is missing, then we need to go back and change. But that it's that way you're really living it, as opposed to just putting it on the poster.
That's a really interesting idea, to do values last. Talk about, again, telling the truth to ourselves. If you've made all these strategies, what values do you see expressed there? I mean, they obviously, as you've developed them, they are your analysis. They are your sense of what needs to be done. They obviously reflect values. That's really interesting. I could imagine it's pretty radical, I think, for most people, to say, oh, we're going to do those last. So love to just have some people comment on that in the Q&A. You mentioned theory of change, and someone's asking, what's your opinion of that? Are you using that term sort of, generally, or do you actually create a document, or is that the impact strategies you referenced?
Yeah, so I do think, so we tend to use the term impact strategy. And the reason why is because, theory of change has its roots in evaluation, and we're actually just trying to document more than we are trying to evaluate. I also think it is a little, we're all comfortable with it, but I think it is a jargon barrier with boards and with others. And so when we talk about impact strategy, it's how does an organization accomplish impact? And we do a one-page graphic that really shows that organizations, it would have the intended impact. It would have kind of what the outcomes necessary for that impact are, what the strategies are to accomplish that, and then what the current program portfolio is to accomplish those strategies. And it just helps kind of be a touchstone. So I would say for us coming out of the process, I know we're going to talk about product later, but part of the product is these documents that are a touchstone, and I would argue a framework or model to have those further strategic discussions. Right.
So in conclusion for now about that, you would document all three of those things in the model. So in your inner circle there.
Yeah.
And that might be a couple of pages, I'm guessing,
Yep.
not very long, because they're sort of the essential engine. Not that they're fixed, but as you said, they're how it goes. And to go back and revisit one of those means that some force in this larger circle has really caused us to question our fundamental something, our fundamental impact, our fundamental business model, our fundamental approach to working with people. And so that gets documented, and that you can kind of use, like you can use it as a communications tool, a hiring tool, I would imagine, right? I mean, this is how you articulate, as you said, what the organization is. Okay, let's move along because I want to get to Nadine's story, and thank you all for the comments you're putting in here. I want to offer, with my strategic planning consultant hat on, my 3.5 panelist hat on, one thing that you said about values. For me and my work, what I'm excited about is connecting values to methods. And I know, Steve, you and I have talked about this a lot. The chosen way of doing the work. So to me, that chosen way of doing the work is an expression of values. So we could all want, a particular outcome, but the actual approach we take to that work, I think, is really important to articulate. So that's what you socialize people to. That's what you want them to own, is the special sauce, the methods, the ways the organization shows up to people, to the work. And for me, I like to make a jump from values to methods, or I like what you said, Steve. Let's look at, in fact, this is, I guess, what I do. Let's uncover our methods. What are we doing underneath all these programs? And that is going to give you a lot of insight into what you believe, right? And if there's a dissonance, to use Nadine's word there, that's a really rich place. This is how we're working, but this is what we believe. Right? Or this is how we work. Let's update, let's get bolder in articulating our beliefs because we're really doing something here. Or, and some exchange there, I think, is a really powerful strategic thinking process. Okay, so thank you both for sharing those models, and it's fun to see the similarities and the complementariness of them, as well as the different tools involved. The four of us want to talk about the tensions and opportunities that this climate presents. As we said earlier, what do we fit inside this tent called strategic planning, or something else if we need to? And I want to start by sharing this data that I alluded to. We asked you, have you recently, or are you now, incorporating race equity? That might be updating your values or trying to, revising strategies, et cetera, into your strategic plan, or if you don't have a plan, just into your organizational positioning. So one of my wordy questions, but you got it apparently. So yes, 76% of people, this was about half or a third of you who responded to the survey, said yes, we are now in the process, or recently had wanted to revisit our strategies based on our deepening commitment to race equity, or you had recently done it. Only 8% of you said no. And then selfishly, as consultants, because this is what we're experiencing, and we talked about in one of our planning calls, we asked you, are you therefore asking 2 or more consultants, maybe a strategy consultant, an equity consultant, or an equity strategy consultant who also wants to partner with someone else, right? Are you asking people to integrate their work because you're trying to integrate the work? And it was about half and half who are, asking consultants to configure in different ways, which I think has huge implications for process and product and price, actually, and a lot of things, right, about how we do this work. So that was really interesting. And then here's a big slide of words, but you all are getting the slides in the recording, which you'll get in a couple of days. You might want to go back to this because I pulled from a number of really evocative quotes when we asked you, what are the challenges that you're experiencing right now with respect to your strategic positioning or process? And I'm just going to lift up a few words. I know some of you may be reading these or not, but it's, this one, here's one, this inability to have productive conflict, the fragmenting of staff around organizational structure in regards to hierarchy and power showing up in our decision-making processes. Raise your hand, Dominique, Steve. I mean, are you seeing this in your clients, right? So we're inside this, quote, strategic planning process, but there's a ton of conflict about who gets to decide and how much trust is there and how do we disagree? And that's why I put that truth to power image in the beginning. One of the reasons, it's like, we're trying to do that and call it strategic planning, right? Somebody said it's really difficult to have a truly participatory process when we recognize the power dynamics across different stakeholder groups. I know Nadine's going to talk about that. Here's a group that, is doing DEI learning and went, we have to go back now and look at the strategic plan we just did and try to merge these two thinkings. How do we do that? There's resistance to looking at how our organization has to change. Just change resistance, like seeing that we're not as relevant. How do we make that change? There's lots of folks, and I experience this a lot, who are struggling with the fact that some people in the organization think the equity work is not the work, right? They think it's just culture work or side work or personal transformation work, which it is all those things, but it's also the work in many cases, and trying to figure out, well, then equity work is strategy work and vice versa. The role of governance and how do we get our board and staff aligned when we're trying to be community centered, right? This last two are, one of them is a racial justice organization saying, oh my God, now we have overwhelming demand and no space to think or be because, finally there's enormous demand for what we're doing. And then the last person talked about needing to realize that as a hunger organization, they weren't really addressing the income inequality that was at the root of hunger, and needing to create a new position called a hunger solutions advocate. And what does that mean? And how do you resource that? And how do they influence the programming? And so these are the kind of quotes we saw of just really, really challenging questions that we're trying to address. Some of them are about how we work with one another. Some of them are about the purpose of our organization as we do this work. So thank you for sharing those. So I want to turn to this tension between process and product. We've spent, a lot of time talking about process so far. And we also have this thing called, are we developing a product, a plan, a document, a video, a PowerPoint? What is this thing that we're culminating with? And Nadine, I wanted to ask you to spend a few minutes sharing your interesting story as an executive, surfing that tension between process and product.
Sure. Well, we actually began our strategic planning process in 2018. And our initial thought was we're going to go to collaborative labs, which is based on a college campus, and they do work with nonprofits and with corporations. And, you bring the stakeholders in, you spend 1 or 2 days sort of locked into this conversation, professionally facilitated, breakout groups, electronic anonymous voting. So it had all these tools that could let people who might not want to speak up in front of their manager get their thoughts into the process. And at the end of it, they produce a document that gives you a head start on your strategic plan. And for some people, that is actually the strategic plan, the whole process. So that was sort of, so in 2018, it sounded very appealing to go through something that at the end, the facilitators would go, here is what you all just told us you're about. But then along the way, we said, you know what, we're not the right cohort alone. We've got to get the stakeholders into the space. Mm-hmm. And that happened because we were having these conversations around the state, that we were going through this process. We were about to put out a questionnaire to our membership. And so the moment that we decided that we were going to have cohorts, Black LGBTQ leadership, Latinx leadership, business leadership, trans and gender non-binary leadership, have their own separate cohorts before our staff, board, and leadership team changed everything. Mm-hmm. Because what was coming out of those bore no resemblance to the assumptions that were embedded, in our document. So
can I just make sure that people know what you mean by cohort? So you mean you flipped it and decided to, that process where you go in the room and everyone dreams and they document it, you decided, let's have these stakeholder groups do that.
Yeah, because part of it is, and everyone, I know that, as a Black lesbian doing this work, it's hard to know if you were a pioneer or a token in a space until you look backwards. And so we thought if we pulled together a room that was, a mix of a lot of different folks, that there's a different energy that comes when you can speak in your own shorthand with people with shared experience. And so we didn't want to create, that question of, we wanted the conversations to produce what the community in that space wanted it to produce.
Mm-hmm.
And so that changed everything about how we began to approach this. And it opened up, I was on a panel not too long ago with Jem Arnold, who is a neonatal surgeon, and she's on a television show about little people. And she was talking about getting her job at the hospital and how the administrators came to her and said, we're going to assign someone to bring a stool to every exam room whenever you need it, so that you will have no problem conducting exams, which she thought was very kind of them to be thinking in those terms. But quickly it became super uncomfortable. And she said, finally, I just said, can you just put a stool in every exam room? And which they did, which was sort of a blazingly obvious thing that only comes from actually speaking to the impacted party. And we had 1,000 of those kinds of moments of, that is so obvious, and so we became so committed to that process that drove our strategic planning through that lens. And I'm happy to talk more about that, how it actually unfolded.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. There's a lot in there. And I want to ask you, as the executive director, because you're not a consultant, how do you it sounds like then you probably went back to your team and your board and said, you know what, we're not done. We're not going to finish this year. We're not going to, how did you change people's relationship to the process maybe is the product, or, almost?
Yeah, well, I think everyone reading the documents, everyone was going, wow, this is so rich. There's no way that we're going, we've just scratched the surface.
I see.
And there were things that immediately were apparent that we had them flipped upside down.
Mm.
We were approaching it with assumptions that had just been completely dismantled in these conversations.
Can you share here, I know we're going to come back to you in a minute, but I just want people to hear the fundamental shift in your overall thinking, sort of the Uber strategy that emerged from that, but then you're still serving in this process.
Well, I mean, I think the big themes that emerged from everything that we were doing was that we needed to center the most vulnerable in terms of prioritizing our work. In fact, I love when Steve was talking about making conscious the subconscious, because I think the unspoken thing around LGBTQ politics for a long time was that the standard of what is appropriate for the agenda of LGBT people tended to be what was important to the most protected, right? And whether it was spoken or not, it became that, and the funding flowed to those priorities. And so when we showed up in the aftermath of a number of incidents of police brutality and racist vigilante violence, when Trayvon Martin was murdered, we began to speak on that. We got a lot of pushback. We lost some donors, mostly white gay men, who were like, why are we talking about this? I mean, it's mission drift. It's not, Inequality Florida's bailiwick. And even as an organization that had put racial justice, embedded it in the origin of our organization, we were upset to discover that pushback, but it was also a moment of going, how is it possible for anyone to know our organization and be surprised by that? That's our failure to articulate and walk that talk in a way. So we had to go back and say, okay, that is on us. No one should ever be surprised to see us when we show up as a repro justice organization, as a anti-racist organization. And so I think that so much of this process was a mirror that was being held up. And so we began to say, why did we show up, for example, in AIDS and HIV? What was the argument? It wasn't unique to the LGBTQ community. What were the things that made it so obvious that we did not even need to articulate why it was a major part of our work? And it was the disproportionate impact. Mm-hmm. And that and that the response to it was hampered by stigma and bigotry. And if that was our criteria, why isn't that our criteria across the board? And where does it cause us to show up where we aren't showing up because of the, subconscious way that the agenda is set by a funding environment that was tilted very much to a particular race and economic class within our movement.
Thank you so much. I saw someone just made a comment about the distinction between strategy and planning. And what you just said is, the most quintessential example of a strategy. Now, it's leading to all kinds of plans, I'm sure, and we'll hear some more about that.
Yes.
But you had a record, obviously, this, I love that language of how are people misinterpreting us? Well, how are we not showing up that way? Why are they surprised to see us show up that way? That's the dissonance, again, to use your word, right, between what you thought you were doing, and what you personally believed, I'm sure, and how actually the organization was being received by some of these other communities, right? And so the strategy is to go to that and then figure out, what do we do, right? What can we do?
Well, and I think one of the things that we did that really was more important than we realized at the time was when we brought the cohorts together. We didn't lead the conversation. Equality Florida didn't lead the conversation. The facilitators from Collaborative Labs did, but we said, don't restrict your thinking to Equality Florida. Ask what this community needs, because it may not fit into our organizational bailiwick, but don't be restricted by saying, we like this, we don't like that. And because of that, the conversation completely shifted. And we began to see, we thought we were saying do that because at the end of it, maybe some of this information will be useful to community centers or to foundations or to others. But it really showed us, this is what I mean when I said we discovered that we were offering to bring the stool to the exam room instead of listening and saying, what do you need? And so yeah, it began a journey that we are still on. We have not produced the document called the strategic plan yet, but it has been changing our organization at each iteration. It has become a part of every single board meeting, a year-long process with our board and staff around racial equity. It's brought to, there's just so much that keeps flowing from this that we're supposed to finish it this year in September. But we'll see, because it may, who knows what's going to happen as we go through this process, because we want a document that we're prepared and eager to share with the public that tells people this is who we are, how we're going to operate, the values that drive what we're doing, our assumptions, and to do it in a way that allows people to go, hey, you know what, I think some of these we disagree, or this is great, and somebody else is already leading in that space, and then we, whatever comes of it. I feel like what we're really building in is the ability to be nimble and have these sort of values that we can sort of what do you call it, a safety fall, when it's like whatever is happening, we know that we are going to center the most vulnerable, and we're going to ensure that the community that bears the brunt of the issue is their voices are centered in it. And we know that if we follow those two guideposts, then then we're being true to our values, and that's what's going to drive our mission.
So powerful. And if I may, that's a richer example than I could ever give of the connection between values and methods. Like the method is, or the strategy, whatever it is, you're saying we're always going to do this. That's who we are. We don't know what it's going to lead to, but the fundamental strategy is an expression of our values and a recognition that this isn't happening enough in our field or our movement. Thank you for sharing that. I want to move us to the second tension and opportunity that was so centered in all the data we got from you. And it also was part of the impetus for us coming together to design this session, which is our own experience as consultants and executives, is the are we trying to, for those of you who are doing equity work, which is an awful lot of you, right? That's not everybody, but a lot of you, 75% of the people who responded to the pre-survey were in the midst or recent midst of doing equity work in the organization. Are we trying to see that as embedded in or the frame for or what of strategy work? And I know there isn't one answer, but we want to surface some ideas around this. Dominique, I'm going to start with you on this one. What are you seeing around this tension between demand and readiness, and where does this fit in the process?
Yep. So I'm kind of lumping people into two categories. And inside of those categories are a myriad of, other ways I would describe clients I'm working in. It's organizations that have been working on this. And so prior to the events of last summer, they had some type of focus on racial equity and had started the work. And then organizations who had not been working on this, but now feel a sense of urgency to do something. They're like, okay, everybody's doing something. They're getting pressure from their staff and sometimes, but less often from their board. And they're really trying to figure out what that looks like. And so, and I think when we first spoke, I think that was the question you led with, was around like organizations that are fully integrating this into some overall strategic planning process, organizations that aren't doing it all, and organizations that are kind of running these processes parallel one another. And what I told you then and what I maintain now is that I don't know if there's a right way to do it because we haven't seen how this all shakes out yet, right? So you use the term readiness, and I also tend to use the term readiness, but that implies that we know what it takes to do this work. And since we've never genuinely created racial equity or social justice in the United States to date, we really don't know exactly what it takes to do this work. And so I just want to say that too, that, there's this idea of like, we want it to be a process that we know will achieve an outcome at the end, but we've never done, we just haven't done this before. And I think we have to be okay inside of that. We have to be okay that we are, that we're experimenting and creating and documenting, and, that's going to be different for every organization, and that it has not happened for anyone yet. The other thing about readiness, I think that it implies that some of the characteristics, capacities, and attitudes need to be in place before you start work on racial equity or social justice. And I don't think that's altogether true either. For me, it's more about an assessment of where you are, what you need to prioritize, and where you can realistically get in a time frame. I think what I've been seeing from organizations, and I tend to frame everything kind of around the adaptive leadership work we do, is that we always talk about technical challenges and adaptive challenges. So technical challenges are those where we have expertise or past experience or an existing capacity, like we know how to do it. People don't really have to change. We can come up with a plan and we can move that forward. And then adaptive challenges are outside of our expertise. They require people to change their habits, beliefs, loyalties, etc. And racial equity and inclusion is a super adaptive challenge. And what I see people treating it like is a super technical challenge. And so what I've seen, out the gate from everybody starting last summer was, everybody had a racial equity statement, right? Right. Everybody put something up on their website. Like, we know how to do that. We know how to do that. We can craft something. We know what that means. We know how to do that. But I equate that to, I had a client who they were having issues with trust amongst their partners. And the leader was like, what we need? A newsletter. No, ma'am. No, ma'am, that's not gonna do it. So that is it's like the technical solution to the adaptive challenge. And I think what we have to recognize is that this work inherently triggers both conscious and unconscious anxieties with your staff, your leadership. Is forcing people to examine their personal values, your organizational values, all your norms and behaviors. Like Nadine was saying, it forces you to test your assumptions, and it is difficult work. We're not making widgets. All of the work that we do is difficult work, but we want to fit it into something that feels more formulaic. But in order for people to do this work and be successful, you really have to design a process where people can find their own entry points into the work, in a way that reflects their own identities and like what it means to them, both as an individual, personally, and inside of the organizational context. And you have to be okay with that frictions going to arise, right? You have to have a leader that can hold that tension, and understand that it's going to be uncomfortable, not just for some people, for everybody, and that everybody is coming to the work from a different place. They have uncertainty and shame, and it's really, it's it's going to be difficult for everybody to process, especially your people of color. But I don't want to minimize the experience for white people inside of this work also. And if you have a culture that doesn't support naming the elephant in the room and having uncomfortable conversations and being able to see things from different perspectives and a process and the tools and the capacities to do that, it becomes altogether more difficult. So I'm going to stop there because I know I'm like just kind of going on and on. And
no, not at all. And I wanted to invite you to, there was a phrase you used in one of our conversations about, the internal culture, the external strategy, and helping people, especially if they're trying to come at this in the context of a strategic plan. Can you share that culture strategy idea?
yeah, so I am, and this is a familiar saying that how you do one thing is how you do everything. And so to say that you are doing work around equity and inclusion in your external facing programs and strategies, but that you're not doing that work internally, it just isn't true. Right. And so like you can't, if you are not equitable and inclusive, be doing that. So we often talk about the equity lens and the equity mirror. So the equity lens looks at the how you are looking at the data, disaggregating the data, using targeted universalism, understanding that people are kind of coming at this from a bunch of different places, and that you're designing your strategies in order to address where people are, even though you're trying to get them to the same place. So Nadine, when you talked about your work and kind of this pushback that you had from economically privileged white men who are like, this is not a part of your work, kind of under that umbrella of targeted universalism, like it's all our work. It's just that you're way out here on this. We have these marginalized communities, they're starting here. And so we're prioritizing those strategies in order to get them where you are, understanding that we're all moving towards the same finish line. So that's how we kind of think about the lens. I think underneath that, it's really an appreciation, and this is often based in education for the historical context that created those disparities, right? And so I hear a lot of conversations, and there, we recognize the disparities, but we're never having the back conversation like, okay, how did we get here? Like, let's look at the policies and practices that have been in place over the last 100 years that actually got us here, that really grounds people in the truth of like why this is like this is. Because again, you're dealing with people, and people have only their lived experience to bring to the table. So whatever education, whatever awareness I have around that, that's what I'm bringing to it. And if I don't have that, then if I don't have an in-depth understanding of why we are where we are, then I'm bringing my own judgments, my biases, like based on what I know about the world, right? And then the other side of that, we talk about the equity lens, is the equity mirror. So looking at who is at your table, and looking at how decisions are made at your organization for your community or the intended beneficiaries, so the people you serve. And so if it's an issue you're working on, then how many people are at your tables that have lived experience with this issue? How many have friends or family with direct experience with this issue? If it's neighborhood based or geographic based, then how many people live in the area? How many people have family that live in the area? How many people on your team reflect the demographics of the people you serve or are from other historically disenfranchised groups? And how many people work directly with the population? And so we kind of look in that in 4 buckets.
Got it.
And the thing about it is that I often frame diversity just as difference. And in my personal life, as well as my professional life, it really is just about creating enough difference at the table where you can see more of the picture, right? Mm-hmm. And so I often tell this story about, which I'm sure you all have heard, about the blind men and the elephant. Have you heard this story? Yes. And so I need all of you here so I can know what I'm looking at, because you are describing this elephant as a trunk, you're describing it as a tail. Like, I need to know, get as much of the picture as possible. And then kind of underneath that or above that, you then will need to look at the power dynamics around your engagement and how people are showing up in those conversations. And do they have the tools to lean back? Do they have the tools to appreciate the input, even if it's not communicated in a way that they are used to receiving? Like, there are all these other dynamics when you start to engage difference. The reason why we're different is because we do things because we're actually different. And so that means that what I hear a lot of people, what I imply from what I often hear is that they want difference, but they don't want the way they change, or they don't want the way they operate to change. So yes, of course, we want all these different people at our table, but we still want to do things exactly how we do them, right? Yeah. Like, you're invited to this table as long as you can play by these rules. Yeah. And that is where I think the friction comes into place, because what true inclusion looks like is making space for that difference and collectively deciding what works for all. Mm-hmm. So yeah, and I go back and forth, but I used to say you should prioritize the inner work before you start your outer equity work, but now I feel like you have to do them in parallel processes. And then you just have to be really honest with yourself and your organizations. Like, where are we in this? What parts are we good at? How do we know? What are we actually trying to move towards? Like, what do our partners think about how we do this? How can we be more honest with them? I mean, these are the questions that you need to evaluate as you're on your own internal journey and thinking about doing the work externally.
That is so helpful to me, what you just said, because we do a lot of this binary kind of thinking, like, if you haven't done your work, you can't do this work. When it's what I'm hearing you say, and this has been my observation too, it's actually a little more nuanced than that. I mean, if you haven't done any work, you certainly can't go out and do work. But if you're doing the work, you can show up in transparency about doing the work. And you know, as Nadine referred to, you'll find out if other people think they're ahead of you in that space. You'll find out if, you know, if people still don't find it resonant or what have you. But it's not like you finished the work. You're never going to finish the internal. So if we wait till we all get finished, that's can actually be avoidance, I think, of engaging in the challenge of doing the work, right, with others.
Yes.
I love that guidance, because that's shorthand we use, and it's much more complicated than that. I would agree with you. I need to be aware of our time, as I knew I would need to be. So there's more that we could say there, and maybe we'll do that on our final thing. I may come back to some of these issues around partnering as consultants, but I want to, in a rather contained way, on these next 2 slides. Now, Nadine, could you share, people are very interested in the methodology, so if you'll repeat again the group that you used to facilitated those cohorts, and maybe just give us an insight about, I know from our conversations that it changed some of the way you're working around economic justice, around trans justice. Do you want to give an example of who the engagement was, and then a specific action that came out of it?
Sure. I'll use our transaction program that we started, which was an idea we'd gotten from South Carolina. And in Florida, the statewide trans organization kept sort of coming apart because they didn't have the structural back end, they didn't. And so we said at the eve of what we thought was the collapse, once again, of a statewide trans organization, that we would provide, the non-programmatic things, bookkeeping and, tax preparation, all that kind of stuff. And they could focus entirely on program. And by the time the conversation was over, they wanted to be part of Equality Florida, have it be a part of the organization. And our counter was, yes, but let's keep it separate enough that if you, at any moment, if you all want to start your, just take off as a separate organization, it's there. So there was a structure for that. And the first gathering of that statewide trans leadership produced a list of priorities. And number one, by and far, far and away, number one was a resource guide. Where can I find a doctor? Where can I shop, without being harassed? Where, just these basic day-to-day living issues. That was nowhere on Equality Florida's, strategy. It had not occurred to us. The things that we thought were going to be top priorities, as reflected in our strategic plan, were completely reversed. And so it became that transaction still exists. It operates somewhat autonomously, though part of Equality Florida, and builds a strategic plan that is incorporated into Equality Florida's strategic plan. And and so I define this. I want to describe that structure because it is always difficult when you join a board. I've joined many boards where I am one of a few people of color, one of the few people from the LGBTQ community. And there's a tension in trying to figure out how you show up in those spaces, how vocal I don't want to, show up at those first meetings and look like I'm here to dismantle this, but I also don't want to sit quietly and be complicit when I'm seeing them do some messed up things. And so the idea that communities needed to be able to speak honestly with each other in order to produce something that wasn't distorted by the very entity that was seeking to be changed by the product of those conversations was a part of what informed how we built that structure. And we did it in a sequence so that by the time our board staff, what we call our council of leaders, which is largely board members who have termed off but are still involved, and some of our core volunteers, we purposely structured it for last and said the conversation we were going to have was going to be informed by the products of those stakeholder conversations that preceded, that this group would not show up with a blank page. And so I think that there were, there's so many things that Dominique was just saying that were so, like, the tension points that I see is largely along racial lines. This adaptive versus technical, I think, is one of the biggest challenges, where the whiteness calls for a checklist of, if that's a problem, give me the checklist. I'm going to fix it. We want to act, fast. Where, BIPOC folks were like, well, wait a second. First of all, understand that this has been around for a very long time. And if you think you have a hot tip, a quick fix, just sit with the arrogance of that statement. Understand that what we're trying to do is get to a place where there's a shared understanding. And if we bring up things that are painful, we don't want you to quickly brush past them and give us a quick solution. And I think that our board and our staff went through a year of meetings once a week or twice a week.
Wow.
That were all about having dialogue around racial equity, specifically, that were not solution oriented, that were about just being with these realities and how you react to them. And so much of that was about trust building, that the desire to not have to deal with it wouldn't produce quick fix mentality, that these are deeply rooted. and I think it, we've seen many organizations that go, oh, our racial justice, the optics don't look good. Let's bring a bunch of people onto the board, or let's hire our first person of color, trans ED. And then you see how quickly that person, after the big splashy press release, a year and a half later, that person's gone because the structure wasn't ready. And so I think that is part of the pace that we have taken, but also just embracing the fact that we're going to get it wrong. I think that's one of the other things about these processes. Everybody wants to get it so that when you finally step out onto the stage, you are absolutely certain that there's no place for critique because you've thought about everything. It's impossible. You will get critiqued because you can't in fact, you should want to. It is part of how you know that you're actually heading in the right direction. For some people to say, you know what, for all your talk, y'all ain't doing this, you're not doing that. So within that strategic planning process, I think preparing organizations for that reality, for that tension within the process is an important part of it. You will never be impervious to critique. You shouldn't want to be. It is part of the ongoing process. And, we are dealing with a structure that has long preceded us, that we are not close to dismantling, and it informs every part of this work. And so I think that's why we, in terms of making the subconscious conscious, I think what we are saying in this lengthy process of building our strategic plan is that we are consciously saying we are not going to give in to the quick fix. We are not going to presume that we are going to fix these things. But what we are going to do is make sure that along this journey, we are asking ourselves, who is the most vulnerable? And we are asking ourselves, how do we make sure whatever step we take is informed, and driven by the folks who are bearing the brunt?
Thank you. There's so much in that. A lot I want to follow up on, and we don't have time at the moment, but I just can't underscore enough that your story of stakeholder engagement, that term isn't even adequate, right? That's like a consulting term. You're talking about a fundamental value set and a shift in how the organization views its role, that I think is a really great bar for some of us who might be using language like that, but aren't in fact ready to be influenced by what we learn. The last tension that we had on here was around leadership and structure issues coming up inside these larger strategy/equity processes. And I'll just name a few things that I'm seeing in my practice. I'm seeing a lack of trust in strategic planning processes because they were originated without acknowledging the history in the organization and sort of starting from a place that doesn't feel honest sometimes to staff, right? And there's this sort of beginning and ending inside a much larger context, often board and executive driven, that I think is increasingly difficult for staff to believe in organizations where there isn't trust up and down that structure. I think there's a higher than ever desire to experiment with structure as a tool in addressing equity and deeper democracy in organizations, and that the strategic planning processes bring up that tension. And again, to this cognitive dissonance, people feeling like, well, wait, if these are our values and this is what we want in the world, is our organization functioning, structured in a way that aspires to that? Or are we saying that, but still operating in really old terms? At the same time, I think there's a big confusion about structure versus practices and an over-reliance as a technical fix on structure. So that I'm saying a both and, that on the one hand, people are hungry to dismantle structures and try different things in the experiments towards greater equity. The danger that I'm seeing, and especially from white leaders, is, well, let's just change the structure. Okay, then put that role on the management team. I see what you're saying. Add a diversity officer, right? And this gets to what Dominique and Nadine were just both addressing, which is these technical fixes, structure as a technical fix, rather than kind of an ongoing experiment around equity and power sharing. So I lift that up because I saw that in your comments, some of you, and I certainly see it in my practice, that there will be challenges to how we're organized as we try on new strategies and refine our values. We have time for a 30-second comment from each of you to this last prompt, and I'm going to be vigilant on my 30 seconds. So you can just raise your hand if you're ready to go, and then we'll do 30 seconds each. And the question is, how can we best show up to this, to our next process? And I'm thinking of all of these groups, and there's more, because of course there's community as well. But this call, the people on this call are largely identifying as one or more of these categories. And I just want your thought, given everything we've talked about, how do we show up to this kind of work in this context? Who's got a thought?
I'm happy to start off, and I'm really just going to like parrot back what Steve said earlier. That's why I was trying to get ahead of him on it. But I think it really is about making the subconscious conscious, and like making a commitment to be really, really clear about where we are, and really honest about that, and transparent about it, and vulnerable, as a way to then figure out where we can get to and where we want to get to. I think oftentimes we're like planning around our blind spots. You're like, well, of course that's what you want to do, but like that's not grounded in the reality of who we are as an organization. And then if I have like 10 more seconds, the second thing I would add is that, we coach leaders around this. And I think now that the Harvard Business Review and others are starting to lift up vulnerability and transparency as critical components of leadership, I think it's giving people permission to really think about this differently. But a leader recently was like really nervous about going before her staff and having this conversation. And in the conversation, we talked to her about like, we'll say that, right? And so she got up and she said, I don't know what I'm doing, and I'm super nervous about it. And I want you to hold me accountable, and we have to figure this out together. And that then creates the space for all the possibilities. But when you get up and you say, I know what I'm doing, this is where we're headed, that, people know that's bullshit. They just do, especially your people of color. They're like, this is not going to work. And so I think really investing in like whatever tools you need as a leader, whether that be coaching or whatever that looks like, that gets you to a place where you can operate in a space of like courage, transparency, and vulnerability as you lead this work is critically important.
Oh, thank you. Awesome. Nadine, your 30-second answer to a massive question.
Sure. I had written down 3 things: vulnerability, clarity, and motivated self-interest. And by that, I mean, I think often when we think about racial equity, there's a sense of, what I see a lot is people feel like they are going to be criticized. They're not going to get it right. They will be called hypocrites if they do it one way. It's never fast enough, never enough. And when I say motivated self-interest, what I'm really saying is understand that the reason for embedding this in your work is not etiquette, it's not optics, it's not just trending. What it means is if you don't, your organization will not exist because you will not be relevant to the context, whatever it is you're working on. So the motivating self-interest is, if my organization is going to have impact and do what we say we do, we were going to have to wrangle with this no matter how uncomfortable it gets, no matter how sharp the learning curve for different parts of our organization. We will not be relevant to the population as it changes in America.
Thank you so much. Steve.
That was great. And I think, for me, I'll pare it back a little bit what Nadine said earlier. It's not a checklist, it's a journey. And so to really ask yourself why you're going into it and to approach it with that openness that you are embarking on a journey. I mean, each of these areas are so complex. And to think about the fact, are you really going to do that in a 4 to 6 month time frame? Strategy is about an approach. And so really thinking about how do you capture that vulnerability? How do you capture that openness? And how do you collectively walk that journey towards the impact that you want to have? Articulating the impact's the easy part. The strategy is the hard part.
The three of you are amazing. Thank you again. And just to reiterate that this was very much a co-created session through multiple conversations. And I appreciate each of you for showing up and sharing your stories and thinking collectively about what now. Thank you all. Thanks to all of you who participated in the survey. Thanks to all of you who are leading edge members. And we welcome those of you considering it. And your evaluation will pop up now. Take care.